The advent of the diesel locomotive in the 1930s on American railroads proved revolutionary. Here was a technology that was truly out of the future, far easier to maintain than steam locomotives, much cleaner and easier to operate. Unfortunately, the diesel locomotive came onto American railroads when the mindset was very much still of a traditional nature. Although there were most certainly steam locomotives that were at home both in freight and passenger roles, a wide variety of steam locomotives on railroads in America were specialized, and were either mostly used for either role. And thus, when the diesel locomotive started to emerge on American railroads in the 1930s, it fell into the same situation. Oftentimes, locomotives were used in specialized roles. For example, switcher locomotives were used almost entirely for switching roles, although sometimes they did find use on small freight trains. Passenger diesels were usually geared for and used primarily for high-speed passenger roles, and freight locomotives were pretty much primarily used for long drag freights. While in a very general way, the diesel locomotive did offer the promise of simplified and more efficient locomotive operations on American railroads, the mindset of railroads at the time was not necessarily geared towards general-purpose diesel locomotives, or diesel locomotives that were equally at home in freight, switching, and passenger roles. Richard M. Dilworth, chief engineer of the Electromotive Corporation in the 1930s, came up with the idea for just that, a locomotive that would combine the versatility of a switcher locomotive with the capability for hauling freight or passenger. To top it all off, a well-used design with easy riding trucks and the capability for high speeds and good pulling power. Dilworth and his associates came up with the design for the NW3 locomotive, which packed 1,000 horsepower, produced by Electromotive's new 567 diesel engine, an elongated frame which had space for a steam generator, perfect for heating passenger coaches. The men at General Motors, of which Electromotive Division was a part, ran with the idea of a road switcher in ad campaigns and began to push the idea. Unfortunately, Dilworth's new NW3 didn't sell well after being introduced in November of 1939. EMD's flashy new 4-unit FT road freight locomotives were rolled out around the same time and eclipsed the NW3 in sales by far. Eventually, only 7 of the NW3s were built, and they all went to the Great Northern Railroad. And thus, the idea for a road switcher was sidelined, partly by the emergence of World War II, but also by the mindset that long-distance passenger and freight locomotives and short-distance switching locomotives were the diesel locomotive's most useful roles in that time period. It wasn't until 1941 when competitor American Locomotive Company, or Alco for short, came up with the RS1 locomotive. This was a well-designed and useful locomotive that was easily at home on all roles. And so the race was on to design the best road switcher that would carry American railroads into the new era post-World War II. In the late 1940s, Dilworth came up with the idea of a BL locomotive, or branch line. This would offer better visibility and platforms for switching, but would also have the look and pull of a road locomotive. Using machinery from an EMD F3, the BL would have more than enough pulling power and capability for long freights or passenger trains. The BL1, later turned into the more popular BL2, is often called an ugly duckling for its less than orthodox looks. And in fact was not a failure. There were 59 of them built. But it didn't have the same success that Alco was having with its RS1 and RS3 locomotives on the other side of the competition. Unique and strange though it was, the BL laid the groundwork for what would become possibly the most successful diesel locomotive up to that time. Towards the end of the 1940s, Dilworth started playing around with the idea of a general-purpose road switcher locomotive. His idea, as he was later quoted, was to make a locomotive so ugly that no railroad would want to keep it on the main line or anywhere near headquarters. Dilworth's idea was to take a switcher frame which had been used on previous EMD products and elongate it with walkways and handrails running down the side of the hood on either side of the locomotive. A spacious cab, decent visibility, access to machinery for maintenance, and easy maintenance in the field would round out his idea for a Swiss Army knife of locomotive, the EMD GP7, General Purpose 7, or often called the Geep for short. The GP7 had decent visibility, about as good as you could get with a high hood in either direction. Most railroads elected to have the short hood on the front or leading end of the locomotive. However, other railroads had their Jeeps set up to run long hood forward. Attesting to their dual capability, locomotives used in passenger service often had a steam generator placed in the short hood, which could be used to heat passenger cars. The GP7 came about at the perfect time. Just after World War II, when railroads were beginning to whip into the post-war dieselization frenzy that would carry them into the future. Production began in October 1949 and ran until May 1954, when the successor GP9 continued with production. The GP7 was 55 feet 11 inches long and 10 feet 3 inches wide, at a height of 15 feet. The average GP7 weighed 246,000 pounds and had a capacity for 1,600 gallons of fuel. The prime mover, of course, was EMD's famous EMD 16-567B, often abbreviated to the 567. A roots blower gave it a distinctive throaty voice, and train brakes were usually 6BL, 6BLC, or alternatively 24RL brake stands. A maximum speed of 65 miles per hour gave it pretty good passenger speed, and an output of 1,500 horsepower was far more powerful than most steam locomotives. The Boston and Maine ordered their GP7s from EMD in several batches, and there were a few inconsistencies between the batches, some of which were corrected later and some of which were never corrected at all. The first batch of GP7s, numbers 1555 through 1560, were built in September 1950 for the Boston and Maine. They came equipped with multiple unit MU control and steam generators, as well as 24RL brake stands. Fans of the Boston and Maine are quick to recognize the rather unique aesthetic appearance of most of the Boston and Maine's GP7s, shared by the GP7s of only a few other railroads, among them the Chicago and Northwestern and the Central Railroad of New Jersey. There was a unique square protrusion from the rear of most of the Boston and Maine's EMD GP7s. This in fact was a cabinet used to house train lighting equipment from the days when the GP7s were used to pull passenger trains. Of this original batch, the train lighting box on the rear was relatively consistent among the different locomotives. Number 1555, 1556, and 1558 did not have the train lighting box applied by EMD, but they were added by the Boston and Maine by 1955. Two of them, the 1557 and 1559, never did receive the square protrusion from the rear. One other locomotive, number 1560, never did either. Although the Boston and Maine, Central New Jersey, and Chicago and Northwestern all had GPs equipped with train lighting equipment, those materials are not found in the EMD parts books to show what they looked like or consisted of. There are also no photos known of the units with the doors open, showing the equipment, therefore leaving the makeup and appearance of the train lighting equipment a complete mystery. In December 1950, a second order of GP7s, 1561 and 1562, were purchased by the Boston and Maine. These came with 27 MU systems. They had train lighting boxes as delivered, steam generators, and 24RL brake stands. The next batch, 1563 through 1571, were built in March 1951. These did not come equipped with multiple unit systems, although they were added by the late 1950s. All of these had train lighting boxes applied on the rear by 1954. They came with steam generators, 6 brake stands. Eventually they underwent changeovers to 24RL brakes. The final batch of GP7s was a little different from the original 2 batches. These were numbers 1572 through 1577, built in April and May of 1953. They came with 27 MU stands, and they also had winterization hatches at the end of the long hood, something that the previous 2 orders of the GP7s never were equipped with. They came with train lighting boxes on the rear as delivered, steam generators, and 24RL brake stands. It's also important to note that this last batch of GP7s were equipped with cab signaling, which allowed them to be used extensively on the Fitchburg route, where cab signaling was routine. Several of the GP7s, numbers 1563, 1571, 1574, and 1576, would later have snowplows applied to the front end. The B&M's GP7s were all delivered in the classic maroon with deluxe yellow striping and Minuteman heralds on the cab sides. The underframes were black with black trucks, but most received silver trucks starting in 1953, although these silver trucks were later painted black. 1555 through 1571 were delivered with a 3-chime horn with all bells facing forward, mounted on the engineer's side of the short hood. 1572 through 1577, however, were delivered with a 3-chime horn, the center bell facing backwards, but it was mounted on the roof of the short hood. The GP7's role in passenger service was short-lived. In 1953, the Boston and Maine began to invest in a new technology, the Budd RDC, or rail diesel car. This new invention was a self-propelled passenger car, essentially, which allowed for the retirement or transferal of diesel locomotives from passenger service to other roles. The RDC was a handy tool. It essentially allowed the railroads to put all their eggs in one basket. Being a self-propelled passenger car, it no longer required the railroads to maintain fleets of both passenger locomotives and passenger cars. As a result, the Boston and Maine retired or sold quite a number of its passenger coaches, and took the GP7s and Alco RS3s and put them to work in freight service. Standing trackside on any number of B&M lines in the 1960s, the Portsmouth branch, the Central Mass, the White Mountain branch. The thrum of a 567 prime mover and the stark, abrupt noise of a Nathan M3 air horn. Would have been ubiquitous with the Boston and Maine experience as the railroad moved closer to bankruptcy. The sight of a former passenger diesel hauling a short local freight on overgrown and light-density branch lines. Throughout the 1960s, the GP7 soldiered on in their freight roles, increasingly being seen on smaller branch line freights as newer locomotives arrived on the scene. The purchase of 50 EMD GP9s in 1957 and 6 EMD GP18s in 1961 supplemented the Boston and Maine's road diesel fleet, meaning that the GP7s were not quite as required for road freights. Nevertheless, the GP7s were still extremely common on road freights on the Boston and Maine, especially on routes like the New Hampshire Division Main Line and the Connecticut River Main Line. Despite the changeover of the GP7s from passenger to freight service in the 1950s, a few of the units still saw passenger service until the late 1960s. Since many of the Boston and Maine's dedicated passenger diesel locomotives had been retired, scrapped, or sold throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, occasionally the GP7s were called up to pull rare moves such as camp trains of heavyweight coaches moving from metropolitan centers like New York City to summer camps in Maine and New Hampshire. Since these GP7s still held their head-end power and steam generators, they were the prime choices for some of these rare passenger moves. Number 1555, 1559, and 1560 were all still equipped with steam boilers despite most of the GP7s having them removed. These units were used on some of the Boston and Maine's longer distance passenger trains that had not been switched over to Bud Rail diesel cars and were still using conventional locomotives and passenger cars. Number 1555 especially was commonly seen on the Boston and Maine's Connecticut River Line passenger trains, which were still using conventional train sets. Additionally, throughout the 1960s and into the early 1970s, a number of Boston and Maine GP7s were leased to other railroads or operations. For example, a few GP7s were leased to the Canadian Pacific and the New York Central, and also to the Morristown and Erie and the Green Mountain Railroad. One GP7, number 1567, was leased to the Mannix Construction Company in Canada, and when it came back to the Boston and Maine, somebody had applied a Mannix logo to the side of the short hood. Number 1560 especially had an interesting incident which occurred on April 26, 1967. The Boston and Maine's southbound freight JB4, White River Junction, Vermont to Boston, Massachusetts, was traveling through Pennacook, New Hampshire when it was diverted from the main line into the freight house siding as a result of the switch having been thrown by vandals. It was later determined to have been local kids who had shot the lock off with a rifle. The train went into the siding at speed and was led by 3 diesel locomotives, EMD GP7 number 1560, an EMD F7B 4265, and an Alco RS3 number 1517. 1560, being the leading locomotive, struck a boxcar on the siding which caused the second unit, number 4265, to push up into the rear of 1560, damaging it. 1560 was repaired and returned to service, but interestingly enough, the back end of the locomotive was painted solid maroon but never had new stripes added, and the locomotive had this interesting look until it was painted blue in the late 1970s. As the 1960s came to a close and the Boston and Maine moved towards bankruptcy, some of the GP7s received a new paint scheme of solid blue with white accents. These blue dips, as they became known by rail fans, first started appearing on Alco RS3s around 1967, and by 1969, GP7 1559 was wearing this new corporate image. It's interesting to note that on the early blue dip as applied to 1559, the entire side sill was painted white, wherein later iterations would have some of the sill painted black. As a financially troubled and later bankrupt railroad, there was no dedicated repainting program for Boston and Maine locomotives. Engines tended to be repainted when they went into the repair shops, and so into the 1970s, many GP7s still wore the old maroon and gold. This usually indicated that they were good runners and therefore didn't need to travel to the repair shops and subsequently be repainted. This did, unfortunately, give the Boston and Maine GP7s somewhat of a ratty appearance throughout the late 60s and into the 1970s. Some units had their maroon either fade or come off altogether, revealing the gold paint underneath. In fact, one unit, the 1556, was almost completely gold. Though they did look ratty, they were certainly good performers. By 1977, the fleet of Bud RDCs assigned to the Boston area commuter service were becoming increasingly unreliable, and after 3 road switchers were briefly assigned to haul some of the most decrepit RDCs early in 1977, the idea of push-pull service utilizing depowered RDCs pushed and pulled by GP7s was looked into. Mechanical department official Lloyd Kierstead and an innovative subordinate, John Doherty, developed a means to make the RDCs and the pushing locomotive communicate multiple unit control-wise. Up until this point, RDC MU cables and locomotive MU cables did not even closely resemble each other. After some research, a means was found to create an adapter MU cable, henceforth referred to as the Kierstead connector. Early in 1978, a test train was operated on the eastern route with veteran Portland Division engineer Paul Gagnon at the controls. The experiment was deemed a success, and push-pull trains became the rule in Boston and Maine North Side commuter service. Ultimately, some 18 GP7s were leased to the MBTA, who by now had taken over the financial responsibility for Boston area commuter service. In fact, a year or so earlier, the MBT had purchased the B&M's remaining fleet of 84 Bud RDCs. This being said, the MBTAization was not as obvious in 1978 and 1979, as the profile of the bumping posts at Boston's North Station would display a half dozen or so blue B&M GP7s just having arrived with, or about to depart, commuter trains. If one looked at the engine numbers and overlooked the fresh new B&M blue paint jobs, paid for by the T, it was not difficult to imagine it was the 1950s all over again at North Station. The arrival of the first MBTA F40 diesels in October 1978, followed shortly afterward by the arrival of the F10 covered wagon diesels in 1979, resulted in the reduction of the use of Jeeps in commuter service and their return to freight service. GP7 1566 was the last GP7 to regularly run in commuter service, reverting back to freight duties in 1981. In the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, some of the GP7s received their last paint schemes under Boston and Maine ownership. This scheme, commonly referred to by rail fans as the Dustin-era scheme, or Dustin Dips, were named after the president of the Boston and Maine at the time, Alan Dustin. This was a simplified blue scheme with the script Boston and Maine on the side of the long hood, and either white trim on the sill, up the nose, or no white trim at all. There were a few variations of this paint scheme. The 1980s would prove to be the last decade for many of the Boston and Maine's GP7s. Many of them were over 30 years old at the time and had served in a variety of roles since their arrival on the Boston and Maine in the early 1950s. The GP7s continued to serve in local freight, switching, and road service roles, but their time was running out. And time was running out for the Boston and Maine Railroad as well. The Boston and Maine had begun to emerge from its 1970 bankruptcy, and in 1983 was purchased by Guilford Transportation Industries, a conglomerate owned by Timothy Mellon, for $24 million. Guilford had purchased the Maine Central Railroad in 1981 and would purchase the Delaware and Hudson in 1984. Creating a super system in New England. The GP7s worked through the mid-1980s, but by 1986 and 1987 were being retired and taken out of service in increasing numbers. They were brought to the Billerica shops en masse and put into storage in the deadline. As the 1980s came to a close, Guilford proceeded to scrap a number of the GP7s, and the ones which they didn't scrap were sold off to other owners or locomotive dealers like Larry's Truck and Electric. Despite this, a number of GP7s did manage to make it into Guilford paint and Guilford lettering and numbering. Among these were the 1563, which became Springfield Terminal 29, the 1564, which became 30, the 1568, which became 32, the 1575, which became 34, and the 1577, which became 35. But by the mid-1990s, even these few GP7s which made it into Guilford livery found themselves retired. GP7s 1560 and 1577, which were sold to Larry's Truck and Electric in Ohio, managed to survive into the 21st century and, in fact, still survive to this day. 1560 was eventually sold to the Union Tank Car Company. The locomotive remains there today and was recently repowered with 645 power assemblies, but other than that, remains mostly the same. The other locomotive which survives, number 1577, which had been painted and numbered Springfield Terminal, was sold by Larry's Truck and Electric to AgRail and became a switcher at their agricultural plant in Illinois. For nearly 30 years, 1577 has worked faithfully at AgRail, and it was recently announced that the Railroad Museum of New England in Connecticut has begun negotiations and talks to acquire the locomotive and bring it back for preservation in New England. It's been said that alongside the Budd RDCs, the GP7s were some of the best investments that the Boston and Maine Railroad ever made. Certainly, the fleet of GP7s served in a variety of useful roles for the Boston and Maine, from passenger service to freight service, back to passenger service, and finishing up freight service for the Boston and Maine and Guilford transportation industries. As the image of the Boston and Maine began to fade away in the 1980s, the veteran GP7s provided a look back at what the Boston and Maine had been, as they had been acquired when the Boston and Maine was still a strong and relatively healthy railroad. If one needed to find testimony to the GP7's faithful service on the Boston and Maine, they would only have to look at the mileage. Certainly, the GP7s combined racked up millions of miles of service for the Boston and Maine Railroad for over 30 years. As was evident on the Boston and Maine, and certainly other railroads around the country, when it came to reliability, it was just a Jeep thing. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to our channel so you'll never miss a new video. And head on over to our website, www.B&MRRHS.org, where you can learn how to support our nonprofit organization, sign up to become a member, browse an extensive online archive of B&M materials, watch more programs, listen to our podcast, or browse our online store.